Hey scholars, it's Miss Marnon. So I'm going to give you a quick crash course in 7.NS.1b. Make sure you guys know what it's all about, and I can let you know on any tricks for this standard. So this standard is all about adding positives and negatives. So we're lucky enough that we can use our calculators throughout the exam for a state test for 7th grade. So we can use them on any assessment or any notes or anything in my class at all. So if there's an adding question, you can add right on your calculator. You can type in the negatives, pretty simple, but there are a couple of tricks to this standard. One thing is when you're adding, there are 2 rules that we follow. And so sometimes they give you questions where they tell you that there's a positive number and a negative number, and they just might call it A and B. And then you have to figure out if their answer is going to be greater than 0, less than 0. Those are some of the weird questions they ask about this. So let's talk about the adding rules. So the first one is same sign rules. When you have numbers that are the same sign, you just add them normally and keep both numbers. So if you had 5 plus 5, it's still 10. If you had -4 plus -8, 4 plus 8 is 12, but they're both negative, so it's -12. Things like that. So if they tell you that you're adding 2 numbers, if you have like an A is positive and B is positive. So if they give you letters, they're saying A is positive, B is positive. What can you say about A plus B? And then sometimes they'll say, if we think about it, positive numbers are bigger than 0, greater than 0. Negative numbers are less than 0. So we could say that A plus B is greater than 0. So this is one of the things that sometimes comes up. If we want to do the opposite, but they're negative, let's see what that would look like. So let's change it to C and D. So we'll say C is negative, D is negative. So what does that mean for when we do C plus D? Well, if we have C plus D, if they're both negative, we know our answer is going to be negative. That means it's going to be less than 0. And remember, it's always going to eat the bigger one. So 0 is bigger than a negative number. So it's going to eat the 0 compared to the C plus D. So those are some of the little tricks for that. Let's talk now about different signs. And when we're talking signs, we're talking about, is it positive or is it negative? So if I'm adding, let's say 4 plus -8, we actually end up subtracting. So you're going to do 8 minus 4. We end up subtracting. And when they're all positive, we call that the absolute values. Keep the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. So if you're doing 4 plus -8, you would do 8 minus 4 is going to give you 4, but since 8 is bigger than 4 and the 8 is negative, it's going to be a -4. If we wanted to flip this around and we wanted it to be -4 plus +8, we're still going to do 8 minus 4 to get 4, but now 8, the bigger number, is positive, so it's going to stay a +4. So when we're talking about, well, sometimes they do it with letters and they do greater than, less than. This is when we need to know if you're adding. So if they say A is positive and B is negative, if they ask you about A plus B, you got to know which one is the greater absolute value. So it could be greater than 0, it could be less than 0. If A is the bigger number, then it's going to be greater than 0. If B is the bigger number, it's going to be less than 0. So sometimes they might show this on like a number line. So if you had a number line, I'm drawing this with my mouse, so please forgive my lines. So here's 0. So if they put A is way over here and B is right here, right? So here's what we can see. We can see that B is closer to 0. It's going to be kind of smaller than A, it's closer to 0, smaller absolute value. So this is the case, then we can say that A plus B, it's going to be positive. A has a greater absolute value, so this is going to be positive greater than 0. So maybe if we did this, let's do it where C is positive and D is negative. So now let's look at this. I'll do a different number line for this one. So if I look at this, we have 0 in the middle. Maybe way over here is where we have D, and really close to 0 is where we have C. So C has a smaller absolute value than D. D is a larger absolute value. So when we add these two numbers together, we're actually going to get a negative value. So when you do C plus D, if you're going to get a negative value, it's going to be less than 0. So those are some tricks to this standard to keep in mind. You can go on and take that standard quiz. If you need any extra help, you can look in your notes for Unit 2, where we learned more about adding. There's also that vocabulary video that's really helpful about adding, but this is something that they kind of ask sometimes on the state test, where they put them on number lines and just kind of generalize. It's just testing to see if you know the rules. So if you're adding with different signs, you need to take the sign of the number with the larger absolute value. So we need to be able to see that the number that's further from 0 has the larger absolute value on a number line. So you can go take the 7.NS.1b quiz. Everybody's going to take it. We're just going to kind of do a check-in, see how much we remember on this. And when you're done, you can click mark as done in Canvas and answer the 2 questions.